Okay, hello, and welcome to this eSchool News webinar, Next Generation Data Strategies and Solutions. My name is Kevin Hogan. I am the editor-at-large for eSchool News, and I am happy you are joining us today for what I know will be a very insightful and important conversation. This event is brought to you by Microsoft. Microsoft is the leading platform and productivity company for the mobile-first, cloud-first world, and its mission is to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. And education is to empower every student. Microsoft believes limitless potential is within every student, every educator, and every school. Together, we can unlock this potential by providing technology that empowers educators and inspires students. Before we get into our conversation, I'd like to take a minute to go over some features of the platform that we're using for this webinar. The event is being recorded, so you don't have to worry about missing a thing. Within a few days, you'll receive an email message that contains a link to the recorded webinar, along with a PDF of the slides. There's also a chat function that you can launch by clicking on that. Feel free, and I encourage you to use this feature to contact someone from the eSchool News team if you're having a technical question, but also really would enjoy to have participation from the audience, as I really feel it helps aid the conversation with the panelists. So with those housekeeping items out of the way, let's get started with our conversation and a brief introduction. First, Dr. Matt Joseph. Matt is the Executive Director of Learning at Providence Public Schools. Matt has been a school and district leader in many capacities in public education over his 27 years in the field. Experiences such as Director of Curriculum and Instruction, Director of Digital Learning and Innovation, Elementary School Principal, Classroom Teacher, and District Professional Development Specialist have provided Matt incredible insights on how to best support teaching and learning, and has led to nationally published articles and opportunities to speak at multiple state and national events. Also with us today, Jason Morales. Jason works for Microsoft on the Worldwide Education team as Senior Business Strategy Leader for Data and AI. He is a project lead for Microsoft's Open Education Analytics Initiative, which aims to empower education systems around the world to use data, analytics, and AI more effectively and ethically to improve learning outcomes. Jason has contributed as a speaker and panelist at EDUCAUSE, Campus Connections Summit, IMS Global, and several other related industry events. And he has also taught at Boise State University in the College of Business and Economics. Gentlemen, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
No, glad to be here. And I totally did not wear the same outfit as the photo on purpose. It just happened to be that way. I see the picture come up and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm looking in the mirror. But it just happens to be the same exact look. So there you go.
If nothing,
you see what you get.
If nothing, you're consistent, Matt. So that's good stuff. But let's dive right in. I mean, when I saw this topic come up, I was really intrigued, and especially when we were able to garner both of you gentlemen to talk about this. As an ed tech journalist, the idea of data over the past 15 years has taken on many different forms. And I'll say, to be honest, that has not always been the most positive of words or phrases that's used in education. I mean, there have been many years back and forth where data was almost seen as a boogeyman, something that would interrupt teachers' thought that they are not an engineer, that they're an artist, that this data can't help them in the classroom. There was also lots of worries about data privacy and the use of that data, and parents having a worry about data warehousing and network security. And obviously, cybersecurity now is still, certainly even with the pandemic, at the top of list of worries. But at the same time, in danger of dating myself, we just watched the sophistication and the use of data bring incredible new opportunities for teaching and learning. So it kind of has this sin wave, right, that has gone on. Now enter pandemic, and I think it's become obvious that data is more important than ever. Maybe we'll get started. And Matt, I'll put you on the hot seat first. Talk about where you see the state of play in terms of the use of data in your district and in more of a big picture sense in education at large.
Well, for me, and thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to chat about this. And yes, I'm going to echo kind of what Kevin says as someone who's been a principal for double-digit years and approaching that as a central office administrator. You put data up on the agenda, and the sense of the room just goes down. But the biggest thing to start with in a district, so my district right now that I work in is about 25,000 students and approaching 40 high schools. It creates efficiency. That is where I'm trying to get the word that we're not confusing data with just raw numbers. I've been in districts in Massachusetts ranging from 2,000 students to 5,000 students. I was in a school, a principal about 1,000, and now in a very large district. And the one common denominator, no pun intended, with talking about data is creating efficiency. I say data is dollars, and that's not dollars spent, it's dollars saved. It's being able to put resources where we need it. So I've been in the teaching and learning realm for all of my professional career and administrative career, and really trying to break down the misinformation that data is just coming to a meeting and flipping through spreadsheets. And it was at first, because that's how we started. From Massachusetts, we had the MCAS. You'd get your MCAS data, it'd be spreadsheet palooza, and it's like, oh boy, this isn't great. But and there's so many things I want to touch on when we talk about data, but as we're talking about student assessment data, it drills down to where our actual need is. And what we're able to see when we look at that is efficient instruction, because we can really pinpoint a performance gap. So I don't want to monopolize the whole introduction, but when we look at a district level, or even I can speak from a school level, was that I am seeing now an evolution of data analysis as really interchangeable, talking about efficiency in instruction.
Yeah. Jason, any of that resonate with you?
Absolutely. And yes, thank you also very much for the invitation and the opportunity to work with Dr. Joseph here. It's always a privilege to be able to have these conversations in these forums and open up these considerations. And spot on, actually. Earlier this morning, I was connecting with a friend of mine, John Ratchey, who's the CIO and Vice President of Kent State University. And he gave a brief presentation as well. And in that, he asked the question, which was foundational to his journey, into supporting the institution, which was, what value are we deriving from our data? And to Matt's point, value takes many shapes, right? There is certainly a monetary component to it, be it revenues or margins, cost savings and such. But frankly, our values are at best, I think, instilled and projected through our mission, our related organizational values, our goals, right, and the objectives we set forth through our strategic and departmental plans. And so data plays an instrumental role in helping us to support and derive, hopefully, meaningful impact and value as we drive these initiatives forward.
Yeah, well, there's so many different aspects. You can go from classroom instruction and assessment all the way back to back office efficiencies. Matt, you're talking about data there. But there are a number of different places where I want to start to talk about the availability and the access to data and what that means, and what faculty members, what administrators. Talk a little bit about your setup, Matt, and how you see that the entering of the data in a day-to-day basis and where it turns into knowledge. Where does that data turn into information for the educator?
Yeah, and the phrase we had a lot when I was a principal was that we were data rich and information poor. We had a lot of numbers, but we didn't have the information. So now when we're talking about the question that you asked about day to day, we're able to extrapolate just extra numbers to the information we need. And we actually had a meeting today. Again, there's data that comes up every day, so I try to be relevant to say this happened today. I met with all of our middle school assistant principals, which is 26, and we went through the data from our assessments. We just had an interim assessment, seeing where we are before we head into a break. And what we were able to do is say, okay, these 3 questions were really preview questions. We're going to extrapolate that. These are the 3 on the open response. And we were able to drill down into our open response work, which allowed us to then look at, all right, we're scoring out of a 4-point rubric, a 1.7. So that information is timely. We're not, again, don't get me wrong, people who are listening saying we want to have a 4 out of 4, of course, or don't get me wrong saying some of those questions are not as important, but the question is about how do we use it day to day. So today's meeting was focused on open response or writing. So we are able to look at specific information through, it was 7 different questions, and we had a very efficient meeting for 2 hours. Because we didn't, one, complain that our scores were too low, maybe a tad, but we didn't spend 2 hours doing that. We didn't look at the preview question, say, why didn't last year's teachers teach this, whatever that is. We were able, one of the first things I said is to be efficient, and we left with action steps. So having that information allowed us to drill down on what those assistant principals were going to do. They left central office here at 10, and this afternoon staff meeting is going to be on that information. And that's the other thing I've been trying to shift is, data is efficiency and it's information. Because when we say different words around what it actually is being used for, people are more receptive to hearing that. This is information that you need to support your instruction. Oh, okay, I'm going to listen to that. Here's data about your tests. Oh, I'm out. Let me check my phone. And I think it's just the phrasing of that we use data every single day, but how we use it in schools in the verbiage gets that day to day. So by, depending on the school, say 2:30 today, the data that was pulled from the assessment will be into practice today at 2:30.
And would you say that it's a perception that has changed anyway? And maybe we can say due to the pandemic where faculty and teachers are less resistant or to go as quickly as they are to their phones as they may have been in the past?
When we're talking about data and analytics of
yeah,
sort?
and the use of it, heading into a meeting and saying,
Yeah,
instead of groaning, saying, wow, this is actionable information.
In an individual view here, I think that could be a whole secondary webinar around leadership and qualities, because I think that stems from how the leader of that information is presenting the data. But I do think that as we become more efficient, that it is pulling it away, because the lens on teacher instruction is so crisp right now, and everybody's talking about that teachers are definitely, as you said, putting away the distractions, paying closer attention, because we're able to drill down. If we were talking about all 3rd grade hasn't done this or that, and people like this isn't relative because we have 25,000 students. We said our middle school 7th grade on these 3 open response questions missed our vivid verbs and we need more expressive language. Okay, that's something we can put in place tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Jason, talk a little bit about the tools themselves and how more sophisticated they may have become over the years, to where that resistance where, at some point a teacher might need to spend 15 minutes just being able to access the data. And now that systems and platforms have become more sophisticated, that it's a lot more elegant, I guess we could say.
Yeah, well, the question actually harkens back to a pivotal moment in my career where one of my managers at the time said, Jason, he said, don't be a tool. And he was not only referring to
triple entendres,
maybe my approach to whatever situation was at hand, but frankly, it's interesting when we have these conversations, the tools really take second fiddle or second seat. They're in the back burner to a couple things that really drive the success in this arena. It starts really with people. You really have to understand as well your processes and systems. This is really more foundational to anything. One thing I've really always advocated is that if you do it right, any and every tool can work to help support and help you derive value, frankly. Now, that said, to speak to your, your question directly, there have been advances in the technologies. One of the very popular technologies in Microsoft is one called Power BI, for instance, which is a free download for a desktop tool. Anyone can use it, and is actually quite affordable, even when rolled out through an institution. And the type of advancement you see in this is I kind of say that it's Excel 3.0, or it's a combination of Excel, PowerPoint, and Access. Access may intimidate some users, but frankly, a lot of our organizations, from the most sophisticated companies in the world, such as Microsoft and others, run our businesses on PowerPoint. Our leaders actually stand behind and look at PowerPoints. When we look at the actual data or information within the PowerPoints, it's very important to understand that that information is only actionable and useful when the PowerPoint is open. It is absolutely useless otherwise. You know what I mean? It is something you can't do. So what a different type of dynamic you have when the data or the information within that PowerPoint remains fresh on an automated way. And what if the skills you have using Excel to make a pivot table, or even just a simple Excel table, and how you convey data these ways, can now be transferred to this environment and now be more visual, be more interactive. The intuitiveness that goes into developing these types of applications and these visual experiences is frankly just a lot more compelling and easier to use than most would imagine. Then when we talk about even more advanced aspects of these technologies and platforms, how we connect and integrate data from different sources, because we also know that every application that we have has reporting, has analytics built in. The challenge is not, can I get the data from this application? The challenge really is, how do I get the data from this application and from that application and from a data set I haven't even created yet, but I need to do in the classroom or in this other context? And how do I bring that together to have a more comprehensive view? And so how we're breaking down these silos, these data silos, and offering a more integrated environment, that has now become tremendously easier and more intuitive for the IT staffs involved, but also for the business and functional users, the administrators, who understand the context of the data. And my last comment on that would be really also to harken back to what we were talking a moment ago. Data is offering a language through which we communicate. And in fact, in many ways, provided there's a great integrity and consideration regarding the context and frankly, the security and privacy, the integrity of that data, when it is trusted, offers a common language through which we communicate. And so this becomes an essential way for us to build up our efficiencies and our reactions and proactive, involvement and response. And so data really, it offers a language, again, to communicate and to engage that is, frankly, in some ways can be more trusted than a lot of other ways we might communicate the efficacy or the impact, right? We like to see it land, in the numbers too. And so the ways that we extend and share data have now also become more integrated into these common tools like Teams, which we're in here now. Just that ability to access it right there and be a more familiar environment is now, all of these things are a lot easier to work with and not limited to IT support and functionality, but also the kind of technologies that those who understand the context and the purpose of using this data, they can make great use and do fantastic things with it as well.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit more about the idea of access. And one of the main, well, there are so many different disruptions over the past 20 months, but one from my personal perspective as a parent is I have been more involved, ironically, by not being physically at the school, but through Zoom and through platforms where I can access my kids' data, more involved than I ever have been in years past. Matt, maybe talk a little bit about how having a larger community having access to that data points to what Jason's talking about in terms of it being a trusted source. Because as a teacher, you can kind of go, well, look at the scoreboard, right? I mean, here's the data, here's where it is, and it's on an ongoing daily basis that can be updated and moved around. Talk a little bit about how you've been able to share data more widely by still at the same time keeping it secure.
Sure, and Jason brought something up that I'm just going to kind of continue off of using the question you said. It was about language and communication. And because I'll just go really drill down from what we were talking about, the parent-teacher conference or the family and teacher conference, where you walk in, and again, I was a teacher and a principal, you had the folders out, boom, you open it up, you have the assessments there, you talk about it, is my kid happy in school? Yes, and here's how they're doing in reading. And that went away. But what didn't go away was the need to communicate that information. Again, I'm saying information, communicate that data. We needed to get that across. And having platforms like Teams, and Jason was talking about some of the other platforms like, Excel and PowerPoint, using those platforms to communicate this information allowed not that I suggest this for any families or teachers, 24-hour communication. I don't mean it that way, but meaning real-time communication. If the teacher put information in about a student, a family could check it out when they get home from work. And then the second half of that is really diving into the security of that. So yes, we have the actual information, we have the tools, and then it's about building trust. And one of the things about building trust about digital data in the platforms we're using is starting off with low stakes, meaning I would recommend to our teachers, make sure we're doing newsletters every month. Sounds silly, okay, whatever, but it's not. We create a PowerPoint presentation and then we put it up, make it an active link. Okay, now we're sharing data on the web. We're sharing information of when we have specials, when we have our schedule. All right, instead of making a whole new newsletter, just add a slide to the PowerPoint presentation and make it active. Now we're sharing what I would consider low stake data over the web, over email, over these transfer systems. So by the time we have those parent-teacher conferences, or we have the recruiting trips, or we have the special education meeting, now that moves from low stakes data to high to essential data. So when you start sharing this over these digital platforms, it's not the first time families see it. It's not the first time they click a link and they see their student or their child's name in front of them. It's not the first time it's like, whoa, everything's at my fingertips. Because trusting the data is like trusting a person. And when you're having, as Jason said, this language that is the information and the communication piece of how you get it across, just like you meet someone for the first time, you're kind of feeling them out. You're kind of like, I don't know if I'm going to want to have a second meeting. It's the same with data. If you spring the first digital piece of information as your student may or may not have qualified for an IEP, parents or families might be like, one, I don't like the platform. Two, this feels yucky to me. And having that security is just like anything else. It's about building trust around the information, because the information's the same, right? That's the one thing about data. It's going to be, if you say, how did I do on this assessment? That doesn't change. It's how you deliver the message and how the person receives the message. So the biggest thing about the data security is building a trust with the receiver.
That's good stuff. Now, Jason, when we're talking about the collection of data and how sophisticated it's gotten, we can also go looking into the future and see where the amount of data you collect and how you collect it can actually start to predict things into the future. This is where we kind of get into a little bit what I think of as science fiction a little bit. But talk a little bit about the idea of predictive analytics, specifically maybe when it comes to the idea of at-risk students. Matt mentioned IEP. I think there's some other ideas around predictive analytics when it comes to special education as well. Are we there yet? Or, I mean, we at the beginnings of those? Talk a little bit about the state of play when it comes to that more forward-thinking use of data?
Yeah, great question. So I'll hearken a story here that is kind of interesting when we also look at the way these tools, which can be quite, affordable and accessible to the smallest school districts or college campuses, but also can, support the biggest type of scenarios. I'll throw in the chat window in support of this very topic, a case study. Ministry of Education of the country of Azerbaijan. So within 4 months, in lieu of the pandemic, right, had to register 1.4 million students into teams. Each student had to go in and register to get access to this online experience that they supported and stood up in short order. Had analytic dashboards and so forth. You talk about trust, Matt, and it's what drives trust is transparency. Transparency is a real key area to helping to reinforce trust. And so the start was to do this, and then it was a very functional kind of analytic effort at first. Just let's see how many students are online, what the outcomes are, how successful are they, what's their test scores look like, what's their attendance in this context, everything else. What they were discussing with us earlier in the week was their use of technologies, as we were talking earlier. By having this data in a centralized and managed space, they were able to use a capability referred to as auto ML. ML stands for machine learning. And within less than 10 minutes, have the technology run against that base of data, and it derived over 7 different potential analytic statistical models, linear regression models, and the like, that help them to identify the top attributes that contribute to student success, so that they could start to predict or look at, in a forward-thinking way, what is the likelihood our students will be successful in their next exams. And with a relatively high accuracy rate, over 80, 90%, 85, 90%, they were able to. One thing that was actually stood out for them was they were absolutely convinced going in that the geography was going to be a criteria that actually influenced the success of the student. They found that wasn't it at all. That a much more telling attribute was how much engagement there was within the system and how engaged online those students were. But these types of things are possible. Now, we're talking about a large data set. We're talking about, a directive that had some momentum behind it, and then now they have this data in a cohesive place to build on. And again, you need some of these large data sets, but generally speaking, while it is quite possible actually to run some of these technologies through their courses and ultimately derive some of these insights, and I have to caveat as a giant disclaimer to say, and this was really important, even from the individual saying this is not hard science in a quick time to derive these models and such. These are clues. These are starting points of which we then need to go further and investigate and qualify what we're learning from these insights. It's not to say, oh, okay, now I ran this, I got all the answers. That no one's there. In any context, don't believe the hype if anyone tells you that's the case. But by and large, most institutions, one, are concerned that they don't have the skill set or the staff that can support these needs, in complex ways at the early stage. And the idea of kind of self-service AI, I don't think we are quite there yet. I think that where we really need to be is focusing on those fundamentals around our culture of our institution, our transparency, and other really qualities of responsible use of data, fairness, privacy, security, these ethical considerations. Who are our team? What are their thoughts? Where are they coming from? Do they have a stake in this? Are they involved early enough in the process to influence and understand what we're doing? These principles that we would kind of put in the area of data governance, but also ethical use of data, which are not the same thing. They're related, but not the same thing. These areas are actually where we need to be today to establish solid foundations. One side is the old data warehouse, kind of the evolution. Now we talk about a data lake house. So bringing a lot of data in and, having some structured data, some unstructured data, but how they work together and how we build this. And then semantic models and data governance structures, things that are supporting this. This is where we need to be to lay the right foundation upon which I think we have opportunities to do some really robust and informative, efforts with AI and machine learning going forward. So there's some happening. There's plenty of stories to allude to, but every successful story I've seen has really built upon that type of foundation. And, isn't just spinning it up and getting answers just willy-nilly in a sense. I don't know, Matt, are you kind of seeing something similar? Where are you at in that journey of trying, being predictive versus being maybe informative or analytic?
Well, it's funny you say that, because my first kind of real introduction to large-scale data, the individual called it predictive, and I got incredibly upset and mad. I was a teacher at the time and the assistant superintendent, and this was, since I just turned 50 and been an administrator of district or school for the last 17 years. So we're talking a ways back, so 20 years ago.
Almost last century, you could say.
Yeah, it was, but thanks for bringing that up, everybody. That's fine. But we were looking at our state assessment, and then we looked at our initial next year, so like October, and the assistant superintendent said, well, I can predict in your class who's going to exceed expectations and who wasn't. And I was like, I really thought they were questioning me as a teacher. Like, whoa, back it up. I got 4 months to work with these kids. I'm going to fire them up. I'm going to coach them up. I'm going to teach them and blah, blah, blah. And the individual said, well, last year they were in this range. And then in the initial one, they're in that range. So moving forward, they're not going to go to proficient. You want them to move up one level. And I'm like, I'm going to get all of my, and again, I was 28 and more immature, and he was right. But the prediction, the piece I have now evolved, because now, going through then being a school leader and being really immersed in it. It's not about the predictive piece, is how you can inform how to use that to support the students. So if
bingo, hit the nail on the head.
Well, thank you.
Two real good points there. One, it's also not new. The foundation of what we're doing, the technologies are enabled greater scale, or in some ways making it easier to use faster. But it's the same principles that have been around for decades.
Yeah,
so that's a key. The other one, though, that you allude to in this, and this is the bigger point in all of it. I personally am not an advocate for saying, let's go predicting at-risk students. I'm more interested in saying, let's introduce the interventions that can help. Let's introduce the ways we engage. Predicting what's going to happen is only one part of the equation, you know what I mean? What we really need to look at is how we're stimulating engagement and supporting the teachers, the faculty, and the students, the learners. That's really where I guess the direction is moving into, you know what I mean? It's not to say, oh, look, you're only going to get this many to graduate. It's say, can we get the right information to the right people so they can do something about it, so we can, improve on that expectation.
Yeah, and well, that's an interesting word, expectation. I'm going to throw two things in here. The other piece with data is it norms people's expectations. So, as anyone who are parents out there, everybody's kids are excellent athletes or excellent students. Like we just hear that. And as a principal, I've heard that for years. But what I mean by expectations is you want to have high expectations always, but you want to have reality in those expectations. So when we go to our predictive, just because we're in this thread, and we just, as I shared earlier, had our interim assessment, so essentially our first unit, and we had, I'm just making up a number, this isn't real, so that doesn't have to put any spin on any district, but you have 25% of your kids underperforming. Well, when you reach the state assessment and you have 20% that were underperforming, yes, you want 100, don't get me wrong, but you essentially met the expectation of where the students are, so you can celebrate those small wins. You can celebrate when you move one student from below expectations to meeting expectations, because you have that information and because you have the strategies to support that student. So for instance, I personally was an average math student. I was incredibly strong at word problems because I could figure them out, but I wasn't as strong in rote memorization because I wasn't paying attention. Okay, so what that showed, if teachers were looking at my data, when it was time to do word problems or problems that I had to figure out, they could actually cut down the amount of time they had to teach me that. Like, I got that. So in that time they cut down, let's say it's 15 minutes a day. Well, now you're going to spend 15 minutes extra on some patterning and more high-level mathematics. 15 minutes a day, 5 days a week for 100 days a year. Look at the time you just were able to give one student from that one data point. And I think that drives a lot. You said earlier about, the cost and value. There's a cost of something, you can look it up, but there's also a value in this information. When we look at professional development, let's just say, okay, like I operate in dollars and cents as someone who signs off on who comes into our district and doesn't to deliver professional development. I'll just use the example I used earlier about open response questioning. Well, we didn't talk about foundational reading skills. We didn't talk about phonetics. We didn't talk about some of those things. So if we're paying high dollar for people to come in for that, well, our kids have that skill. Let's invest that same money, same cost, wherever you put it, but the value in teaching our students how to be more critical thinkers and writers. And that all stems from looking at data, information, analyzing it, and then putting it towards how you support students. After all of this, all of these webinars, all of these digits, it's all about how we're helping students to be successful. And having that information has a high value. And having that information allows teachers to do their jobs better. Not saying that they're better teachers with the data, saying they can be more efficient. Look at your phones. Like, you go, anybody who's traveling for the holiday, you're gonna use your GPS, you're gonna be more efficient. That's the world we live in. Because you know what happens when you go on a trip? Sometimes there's traffic. And your little phony thing says, hey, save 3 minutes to go here. And you hit yes. That's what we do in schools. We get our interim assessment and say, great, the writing pattern has improved. Let's take another course by expanding our vocabulary. It's the same information. That's data you're receiving. It's data, granted the smartphone is processing, and then it gives it to you.
There's another thing about it. It's situational, right? And that's happening in real time. And that's happening in the moment, and the factors that exist here. That are informing those updates in the GPS ETA if you take this route versus that route in this situation. So we also, when we think about applying that in the education context, and there's another inherent danger to the idea of what we're attempting to predict on the at-risk students and stuff, which, by the way, I want to make a comment. Our own company is guilty of promoting this idea of help you predict at-risk students, right? I mean, we're the ones even who promote this at times and in certain ways. But when you think of that, that's actually really just informing or supporting the policymaker or the leader who is attempting to forecast an adequate expectation for their budget or everything else. The core attributes that often contribute to the legacy models, the traditional way we look at this, tend to be demographic factors. This is why you were doing it 20 years ago, and many are using similar demographic attributes today to derive their predictions. Well, here's the problem with that. Are you going to change the demographic of your student base? What's the intervention? What's the opportunity, right? Today, the ways that when you talk about what's on your phone, when you talk about the ways we are, seeing the right information, when I first started using a certain app, I was not very good at spending money online, but suddenly they really know how to catch me. You know what I mean? I spend more online now. They've done better at getting me the right information for me at the right time, just in time for Christmas, just in time for my kids, whatever it may be. And it's a similar context of how are we looking at behaviors, at attitudes, at really qualities that go beyond the demographic factors and attributes, but actually the moments of engagement. How are we identifying signals? There's our students showing up every day. Wait, why did they stop showing up? Is that a signal? Is that something we need to respond to, or is that related to some? Are there ways we can personalize our engagement, and check in and see what's happening? And these are the areas where artificial intelligence and predictive type of analytics and machine learning can play a real role, is helping us to transcend this legacy model of using, frankly, insufficient data and information to predict in support of leaders. And it's not really about the student, the learner, or those in the direct support system, where we're really wanting to say, again, how can I inform that teacher or that program leader or the student themselves of something that can help them, that is more personalized, is more relevant to their given situation at that moment. These are, what I mean? These are the areas we explore now, and need to see in our schools, not just in our commercial advertising context, but in the areas that really make a difference for our communities and for humanity at that, in that sense. So.
And that brings us back to something that we were talking about at the beginning of the conversation when we were talking about data as a boogeyman, and perceptions of people looking at it, especially when it comes to Johnny or Jane's math scores, or more seriously, their IEP data, and the perception of privacy and what my district is doing with the information of my child. How has the state of play there changed in the past few years? And then I'll give you that other kind of looking forward question. I mean, where are we going with that? I mean, are we at a place now where maybe that perception is better than it was before? Are the tools more secure than they've been before, that we can have parents and the greater community not be as afraid of data warehousing? And I'll put that on Matt. I'll put that on your plate first.
Yeah, I think they're getting. I'm used to it. And again, the hard part about having some conversations post-pandemic is even thinking of uttering the phrase, some things that we've gained from the pandemic. And I don't mean that we would ever want this to happen, ever. However, what has come from it are unintended outcomes where families had to be online. Again, nobody would want this to happen or ask for it. However, allowing families to utilize the online tools have helped and reduced kind of the stress of using these tools. And then also having much more, when you can't have like I talked earlier about the parent family meeting with the teacher, you can have this conversational style of things and get off track a little bit easier. When you're looking at raw information in front of you, it gets very specific. So what families have been able to do was talk about what they see, not about what they think they heard, about what's in front of them. So they're having that trust that, one, it's accurate because they're seeing it, and two, it's ongoing. So they're also seeing the progression. They're seeing, and again, it's whatever level it's at. Sometimes it's just color code. It was red, then yellow, now it's green, and we're seeing whatever that information is over time. Families are getting used to this pattern, and families are getting used to this level of conversation. But what it's actually also done is have a much more specific dialogue and questions back to the teacher. instead of, is my student good at math? Yes. What's his grade? B. Great. What they're able to see is the splinter skills in there. Oh, that might, using the Matt Joseph example, not great at factual recall. Let's do some of these practices, but is good at problem solving. Oh, not as great on this type of science questions, but hands-on. So families are starting to have the terminology and language because they see it. They see the standards-based report cards. They see the evaluations. And we've talked about, at risk, but we're also talking about exemplary students who are at the cusp of getting into honors or getting into AP, because you've removed the emotion. You've removed, this teacher does or doesn't like my child. You've removed the emotion from that conversation to say, no, that's not accurate. They have an 89. With these 3 extra things, they'd actually qualify. So you've given families the vocabulary that can talk about students, they can talk about growth, and they can talk about progress.
Without this worry that information might be spread out amongst others to be compared.
Because it's a very intimate, in the sense of a one-way stream, that the family and the educator have that information. It's not like, when I went and tried out for a sports team and they put who made it and who didn't on one printout up on the locker room wall, where that is not quite so private and it's not the most secure, where they can have that secure portal. They can have multiple, SIS systems, LMS systems, many operating tools to allow for specific data for specific people and privileges.
Yeah, Jason, talk from your perspective a little bit about the privacy aspect and how that has improved over the years.
Well, I don't know that it's improved. Technically, I think that there are things that have improved, but there's some fundamental things. Generally speaking, I don't know that the community at large, and particularly young people, have been advised, coached, taught that the environments, for instance, around social media, this is a public space. It's a public space. Would you go out into the park and act this way? And many do, but there is the idea, when I'm holding my device and I'm interacting in these ways in my own room, privately and such, that I'm actually in a private environment. And so there's really it's a stretch. It's hard to understand that if I was in the context around immediate public reaction and response, I might, be more cognizant of how I communicate, how I express, and so forth. These are principles that are not yet fully grasped or understood, and I think there's more to play out in this. But one of the areas, and this, is an area that I just implore anyone to explore and understand and just sort of evaluate when we think about privacy and the role that we play. So Matt, you are a steward of the data and the information of those in your school. You are really one of the protectors there, standing there and advocating on behalf of those in your institution to defend and protect their information, within the context of what you do there, and at the same time, how we look at doing that. See, Microsoft is a technology company. If you look at the mission of our company, which was expressed in the beginning of this session, to empower you to achieve more, we are trying to provide the technology for you to do more, to be better, to do your thing. When you look at the situation or context where there's always trade-offs. There's trade-offs, right? We were talking earlier about monetary value and the impact there. Well, when something costs less, right? Oh man, I'm getting a lot of technology here for less from an advertiser. what is the context? What is the mission of that company, and how are you partnering with that company? What will the objective be around the use of that data, the privacy, the security, and how that's extended? For Microsoft, where we have gotten better is not necessarily about the technology alone. All of us have the technology to be able to be very private and very contained. What's more important are the policies and the directions and our commitment to core values and what is behind how we're standing up our approach. And when you have advertisers in the game, retailers in the game, and then technology companies in the game, I always implore leaders to really explore the mission, the core values of those partners. Again, it's a trade-off, but those free technologies sometimes are coming at a cost that may be imposing on our privacies or securities. I think we have developed a lot more language in a broad sense in the world and the conversation, that exists in industry to start looking at this more critically, to really think about, what we're doing to ensure better security and better support. But we're also feeling the pressures of these industrial and commercial and these cost-oriented things. So we have to evaluate these trade-offs and really understand, what's to come there. And I guess I'll leave it at that kind of high level for now.
Yeah.
But I think that's where there's a lot of development these days is in our policies and approach.
The policies aspect of it, yeah.
Yeah.
I knew that the toughest part of my job this afternoon would be to end this conversation. We could go on for quite a while. There's an 8-part webinar series here, I think, that we've started part 1 on, but with the few minutes that we have left, I want to kind of leave you both with one more question. Hopefully it's a glass half full within the context of, we keep talking about the pandemic, and hopefully that at some point is going to dissipate into the distance. As you said, Matt, there are a lot of innovations that have come out of that experience, with some discoveries that have turned into innovations, especially when it comes to the use of data and accelerating the education space's perception and the use of it. But let's go away here, maybe with some forward-thinking, again, glass half full thoughts on where you see data and its presence in your line of work. Matt, we'll start with you again. Over the next 3 to 5 years, what are some of the things our audience should be looking for in terms of the next steps in the evolution of data in the classroom and in the back office?
Sure. And again, this is an 8-part. I'm adding a 9th part right here, is that one of the best things we can do for our students is teach them how to think, not what to think. And the next evolution of data is giving students the same level of access to a point that we have. This entire 53 minutes have talked about how we've used it, or teachers have used it, or administrators have used it, or parents have used it. And we're saying we're using it for the students. Okay, well, the next level of this and forward thinking is that students see it. And the students are able to look at it. And the students, we always want them to be reflective. We want to self-assess, and we want them to be empathetic. And well, to do that, they have to have the same information that we do. And anyone who has teenagers knows you tell a person something, the teenager to do it, they're not doing it. But when they look and figure out on their own, they're going to be a little bit more motivated. So when we step back as educators and let our students have the level of information to inform their thinking, they are going to change their habits in their learning as well. So that's where I see the next level of this, is taking it and providing students some access and some guidance around what they're seeing.
That's great. It reminds me of just recently an in-car experience with one of my own teenagers who was staring at their phone and I gave him the old dad, like, you spend too much time on your phone, and it was dinging this and that, and it was my daughter, and she looked at me, it's like, I just got an A on my chemistry test. So she had the data, she was looking at her data, and as you're saying, has some agency over her own experience there, that's definitely glass half full. Thank you, Matt. Jason, I'll put you on the hot seat to try to top that. In terms of where we're going in the next 3 to 5 years, I think you might have a few.
Yeah, I'm gonna get a little woo-woo here even with it, actually. I think that what we really are challenged with is we have an engagement problem. You talk about teenagers and high school students. We actually are seeing real challenges when it comes to genuine engagement at that level, right? What is motivating them to be engaged? So more when the experiences are more personalized, right, for all of us in so many other contexts, we need to bring that into the education experience for our learners, our students. They need to, again, I love what you're saying about taking ownership of that experience, having more direct access, not merely to the grades and the marks and the test scores, but also to the competencies they're developing and to the skills they're gaining and how those skills relate in the workforce or in their personal lives or in their creative endeavors. How, this is an area where, again, the use of data above and beyond just the traditional set of things we're collecting, expand into data assets, data points that are more relevant and salient to the learner and student in that context. That's where we need to be. We have the technology foundation for it. It's really just a matter of the commitment that we have in our communities, in our schools and institutions to see that through. That is all becoming much more accessible and so forth. But in this spirit of also throwing a kind of a wild one out there, a wild card, so to speak, I noticed that just a couple days ago, Bill Gates made a comment about how our work meetings within a few years are going to start existing in the metaverse. The metaverse. Now, what is this three-dimensional experience and environment? When we talk about how we will capture the imaginations of young people, when we look at what they're exploring and understanding, if we start to depart too far in our education experience in these traditional, learning environments from what our young people are learning and experiencing otherwise, we start to put at risk the value of these institutions to those learners. And so I think that there will be more exploration for these types of new experiences, these new, altogether environments, and the move through the pandemic to more virtual learning experiences and online experiences have sort of paved the way for that. But it will be interesting to see how these types of technologies start to find their way into the classroom. And it's working with folks like you, Dr. Joseph, and your peers in terms of advocating on behalf of the learners and on behalf of what's right, in education from a value standpoint that we can hope to really enforce and promote a great direction that drives supports diversity, equity, and inclusion within that context. So thank you again very much, Kevin, for the opportunity.
Thank you, Kevin.
And Matt.
Yeah, thank you, guys. I do see our time is about up, so I'm going to wrap it up here. If you submitted a question that we didn't get to in the Q&A, someone will follow up with you shortly. I'd like to thank our presenters. Obviously, Matt and Jason, was a great conversation. I'm going to have to take a nap now. It was pretty intense, but it was a very informative presentation and really insightful. And I'd also like to thank the audience members for joining us as well. As a reminder, you'll get an email within the next few days that contains a link to this recording along with the slides. Thanks again for participating and have a great day. Thanks, guys.